Zama, 202 BC. The day Rome answered Cannae. I had seen Hannibal break Rome once before. At Cannae, I watched our army disappear inside a ring of dust and shields. 14 years later, in Africa, I stood under Scipio's command and saw Hannibal's line waiting across the field. This time, Rome had not come to survive him. This time, we had come to answer him. At Cannae, I was young enough to believe that a line of men, a wall of bronze and leather, could hold back anything. I remember the heat more clearly than the blood. I remember the dust grinding in my mouth, the breath of the men beside me, the heavy smell of sweat and iron, and the way the Carthaginian center seemed to bend backward, as if it were already breaking. We thought they were falling. We thought the enemy was giving way. Then the ground behind us began to roar. That sound still lives in me. It was not just shouting. It was the sound of men realizing too late that they were surrounded. The dust thickened. The sky turned pale. A man near me kept saying his brother's name, though I never knew whether he was calling for him or warning him. Then the space we had was gone. One moment I could see the standard ahead, and the next I could not tell front from rear. Spears came from the side. Shields slammed together. Men pushed where there was nowhere to go. Cannae was not a battle after a point. It was a closing fist. I survived because I fell where others fell, and because the press of bodies carried me under the killing. I do not pretend there was courage in it. There was luck, and there was terror, and there was the instinct of an animal that does not yet know it is dying. When I crawled out at dusk, if one can call it crawling, Rome felt smaller. The Republic still stood, but in every home I knew, Hannibal's name had become a thing spoken low, like a curse or a prayer. 14 years passed. 14 years of war, raids, ruined fields, broken alliances, and men who had never seen Cannae speaking of it as if they had. 14 years of Rome learning not to rush, not to boast, not to offer Hannibal the kind of fight he wanted. By the time I was called to serve again, my hair had gone iron gray at the temples. My hands were harder. My back hurt in cold weather. I had lived long enough to see younger men look at old scars, the way children look at relics. And still, when I heard that Scipio had carried the war into Africa, I felt the old fear wake up in my chest. That was the great change. We no longer waited for Hannibal in Italy as if he were a storm that might pass if we endured it. Scipio understood what others had been too proud or too frightened to accept. If Rome wanted peace, it would not come from hiding behind our walls. It would come from forcing Carthage to feel the war at home. So he took the fighting across the sea. He moved with that calm, measured confidence that unsettled enemies more than shouting ever could. He gathered what strength the Republic could spare, trained it, drilled it, and marched it into Africa. When I first set foot there, the land seemed made of hard light. The air was dry and sharp. The earth looked pale in the sun, and the wind carried dust that got into your teeth before noon. It was not Italy. The ground did not feel familiar beneath my sandals. We built camps, broke camp, built again. We watched the horizon. We watched riders come and go. We heard of negotiations, broken promises, alliances shifting, and the Numidian king Massinissa joining us with his horsemen. That mattered more than many in Rome understood. In Africa, cavalry was not a decoration. It was the arm that could open a battle or choke it to death. And then Hannibal came home. Even now, I cannot say those words lightly. Hannibal had spent years in Italy, haunting our roads, burning our confidence, taking our allies away from us one by one. But he had not broken Rome in the end. Not fully. We had endured him by refusing to meet him on the terms that made him strongest. And when Carthage finally called him back, it felt to me like a man returning from a long knife wound, to see whether the blade had fully entered the body after all. Every old soldier knew his name. Every veteran of Cannae carried him like a scar under the skin. Some men said he was a monster, some said a genius, and some said both. I only knew that he had once stood where I stood now, and made the world collapse around us. In Africa, however, he was no longer the hunter alone in foreign land. He was defending his own city now. That hurt. He had veterans with him, men who had survived years of war, and also new levies gathered in haste. He had elephants too. Those living towers of noise and panic that can seem like gods to frighten men and like fool's tools to calm ones. We heard much about them before the battle. We heard of the strength of Hannibal's center, of the veterans he placed behind younger troops, of the harsh peace his enemies hoped to impose if he failed. Carthage was not fighting for glory anymore. It was fighting for its breath. So were we. That is the part outsiders sometimes miss. Scipio did not march us there because he loved risk. He marched us there because Rome had bled for too long already. We had lost fleets, armies, towns, sons. We had paid in grain, silver, and grief. Every year the war went on. More men feared that Hannibal might still turn the tide somehow, that some disaster yet unseen could undo all we had regained. Scipio ended that fear by dragging the enemy into the open where Rome could answer it. Before the battle, he spoke to us in the plain voice that great commanders often use when they want men to believe something dangerous. He reminded us that Hannibal was not magic. He was flesh. He had beaten arrogant Romans once by making them blind to discipline, but we were not those men anymore. We had learned. We had Massinissa's horsemen on our side, and our infantry had been drilled to hold its order no matter what moved against it. I saw the ranks and felt something I had not expected. Not joy exactly, but a hard and bitter readiness. These were not the overconfident men who ran toward Cannae thinking speed was courage. These men knew the price of disorder. We made camp near the field at Zama. The exact place, if you had asked me then, I could not have named with certainty. It was open country near the land of Carthage, dry and broad enough for maneuver, and that alone made my stomach tighten. Open ground meant cavalry room. Open ground meant elephants could charge. Open ground meant there would be nowhere for fear to hide. The morning of battle arrived bright and merciless. I remember waking before the trumpets, hearing men stir in the dark, hearing metal tools scrape against wood as armor was fastened, hearing coughs, curses, prayers, the smell of cooked grain mixed with horse sweat and trampled earth. We ate because soldiers eat before battle even when their mouths are dry. I chewed without tasting. Around me, the older men were quieter than the younger ones. The young talk too much when they are afraid. The old go still. I looked over the field when the sun rose and saw Hannibal's host spreading across it. I could not count them all. No one can truly count an army from the line. Ancient numbers always grow in the telling, and I know that now, as well as I know my own scars. But I could see enough. His infantry stood in layers, and the elephants were there in front, huge and uneasy, with drivers and javelin men clustered around them. Behind them were his veterans, the men who had seen Italy and survived it, and I knew at once that this was not some fresh, frightened levy army. These were men who had looked death in the face before, and across from them stood Scipio's army, with our infantry in disciplined lines, and the Numidian cavalry ready on the wings. Massinissa's horsemen looked almost too light to be war, with their speed, their movement, their confidence in the saddle. They rode like they belonged to the wind. Compared with them, our own mounted men seemed heavy and solemn. But on this field, all of it mattered. The first thing I noticed was not the elephants themselves, but the sound they made. A deep, restless booming, like drums under the earth. Then the line ahead began to shift. The beasts were driven forward, and for one strange heartbeat I felt Cannae return to me whole. My mouth went dry. My fingers tightened on my shield rim. The old terror rose so fast that it was almost a sickness. For a moment, I was no longer an older man in Africa. I was a younger one in Italy, staring into a disaster I could not stop. Then the Roman line did something that Cannae had not taught us to do. It opened, not in panic, not in collapse, on command. The front ranks parted and made lanes, and men on the flanks hurled missiles and shouted until the elephants began to lose their confidence. Some were turned aside by noise and iron. Some ran where they were pushed by fear and pain. A few came thundering through and met spears, men stepping aside at the last instant and letting the creatures rush into empty spaces or onto their own line. The air filled with shrieks, animal bellows, and the crack of missiles striking hide. I watched one elephant rear and stumble. Its driver clung to it like a barnacle. Then it turned, maddened, and crashed sideways into the men behind it. That sight broke something in the Carthaginian front. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. The beasts had not done what Hannibal needed them to do. They had not shattered our order. They had only added confusion to his own. On the wings, the horsemen were already moving. You could hear cavalry before you saw it fully. The pounding of hooves travels through ground and bone. Dust lifted behind the Numidian riders as they swept outward, fast and loose and hard to pin down. Hannibal's cavalry fought them, but Maecenas' men knew how to worry an enemy into strain. They circled, they probed, they struck, and withdrew. They were not trying to win a single glorious clash. They were trying to stretch the field until Hannibal's men could not breathe inside it. I remember glancing left and seeing one of our standards sway as the lines adjusted. The men around me kept their feet planted. No one rushed. No one shouted nonsense. We had been taught to wait, and waiting in battle is harder than charging. It feels like standing before a door, while something heavy keeps throwing itself against it from the other side. Every nerve wants motion. Discipline says hold. So we held. Then the infantry came together. The first impact is never like men imagine it in stories. It is not a single thunderclap. It is a series of brutal collisions. Shield on shield, spear on flesh, foot jammed into dirt, men shouting through clenched teeth. I drove my shield forward and felt it catch. The line thickened. Breath became loud. All around me were the sounds of effort. Grunts, curses, the scrape of sandals, the rattle of armor, the wet sound a wound makes when a body continues moving after it should have stopped. Hannibal's front ranks pressed hard. His men fought with skill. I will not take that from them. They were not cowards, not by any measure. But the shape of the battle had already begun to tilt. The elephants had failed to decide it. The cavalry on both wings was pulling and stretching and testing. And our infantry, though stressed, stayed together. We did not open gaps the way the men at Cannae had opened them. We did not chase where we should not. We did not crowd into the center with blind eagerness. At Cannae, I had felt the enemy's line wrap around us like a net being drawn tight. Here at first I felt something different. Pressure, yes. Noise, yes. Fear, absolutely. But not that awful sense that the world itself had been arranged for our destruction. That realization came slowly, and then all at once, I began to notice that Hannibal's first line was giving way, and that his second was being forced into the fight before the field was ready for it. I saw men behind him trying to keep order while the front staggered. I saw the elephant chaos still drifting through his own formation. I saw the cavalry battle moving farther and farther away as riders vanished in dust. And then I knew something was wrong for them. Not for us. For them. That feeling is hard to describe. In battle, a soldier usually knows only the moment he is in. He does not see the whole board. He sees the man in front of him, the spear coming from the side, the shield cracking, the friend beside him slipping, But sometimes, in the middle of all that, a shape appears in the noise. You realize the enemy is not doing what he planned. You realize the trap, if there was one, is not closing. You realize the other side is struggling to hold its own design together. At Cannae, we had been the ones whose lines bent inward. At Zama, it was Hannibal. The return of the cavalry changed everything. I did not see the first movements clearly because the dust had risen so high that the field seemed half erased. But I heard it before I understood it. The roar of horsemen coming back at speed, the cries of men suddenly finding themselves struck from behind. Massinissa and the Roman cavalry had routed Hannibal's horse on the wings, and now they were swinging around. When they hit the enemy rear, the sound that rose from the Carthaginian line was not one shout but many, all breaking at once. That was the moment the battle turned inside out. We had been grinding forward inch by inch, and then suddenly the enemy behind us was no longer behind us in any meaningful way. The horsemen came crashing in from the rear, dust and bodies and screaming mounts. Hannibal's veterans in the center kept fighting, because veterans do that. They can be surrounded by change and still stand in place for a time. But even the best infantry cannot fight forever with panic at its back. The air filled with confusion. Men looked over shoulders they should not have had to turn. Standards shifted. A gap opened where no gap should have been. I remember seeing Scipio's line tighten, not rush. That is what made the difference. He did not throw us into a wild chase. He used us like a blade held steady in a hand that knew where to cut. We pressed forward in order, step by step, while the cavalry behind the enemy kept hammering their rear. Hannibal had placed skill against skill, but he no longer controlled the field. He was being compressed by forces he could not answer at once. I think of Cannae whenever I remember that moment, because the contrast was so terrible and so clear it almost hurt to understand. At Cannae, the ground itself seemed to turn against us. At Zama, the ground belonged to discipline. At Cannae, the enemy had lured us in until our center was swallowed. At Zama, Hannibal's own plan had been broken before it could fully breathe. He had brought veterans, elephants, and clever placement, but Scipio had met each piece with calm of his own. Our infantry held. Our cavalry returned. The enemy rear was struck. The shape of the battle could no longer be repaired. I was driven forward with the line, shield raised, lungs burning, and all around me men were shouting not in triumph, but in exertion. There is no clean beauty in that part of a battle. There is only labor, and the knowledge that the other side is tiring first. I saw a Carthaginian soldier fall to one knee, and then vanish under the press. I saw another throw down his spear and try to run, only to be caught by riders sweeping in from behind. I saw Hannibal's veterans try to regroup, their faces set in the grim mask of professionals who know they are losing, but refuse to admit it with their bodies. And then I saw Hannibal himself, or at least I believe I did. He was not some shining figure from a story. He looked like a commander. He looked tired. He looked like a man watching his last chance slip past him in pieces of dust and steel. Whether every detail I remember is exact, I cannot say. Ancient battles are messy to the eyes of the men inside them. But I know this, the Carthaginian line was no longer a line. It was fragments. The cavalry pressure from behind had become a knife in the back of the whole field. Our infantry, still ordered, still advancing, became the wall against which the rest broke. When the collapse came, it did not come as a single dramatic fall. It came in stages. First, a wobble. Then, a spreading uncertainty. Then men no longer looking to their officers, only to escape. Then the sound of a battle becoming a rout. Dust rose so thick that at moments I could see nothing but the backs of men ahead of me and the blur of movement beyond. Shouts changed tone. Orders became pleas. The force that had seemed so dangerous at sunrise now felt thin, as if Hannibal's army had been stretched beyond what it could bear and was tearing along hidden seams. I did not cheer. I did not feel joy at first. I felt disbelief. 14 years after Cannae, I stood in an army that had not broken. That was the thought that shook me most. Not that Hannibal was losing, not that Carthage was falling, but that Rome, which had once been trapped and slaughtered by the same name, had learned how to stand until the trap failed. By the time the battle truly ended, the field was full of scattered men, dead horses, abandoned shields, and dust settling over everything like ash. Hannibal withdrew with what he could save, but there was no saving what mattered most. His army had been beaten beyond repair. The war, which had haunted Italy for so long, had been carried back to Africa and broken there. Afterward, the silence felt stranger than the battle. A field full of dead men is never quiet in the way a temple is quiet. Flies come quickly. Horses breathe and snort where they are still alive. Wounded men make small sounds you can hear if you try not to listen. But the great noise is gone, and that absence can feel larger than the clash itself. We moved through the aftermath carefully. Shields were lowered. Men looked at one another as if checking that their own faces still belonged to them. Some sat where they stood. Some bent over and vomited from exertion or fear or both. I did not speak for a long time. News traveled faster than the dust settled. Hannibal had been defeated. The Carthaginian power to continue the war was broken. Carthage would be forced into a hard peace with Rome, stripped of the freedom it had once used to challenge us. The terms would be harsh. No one among us doubted that. The city that had sent Hannibal across the sea would never again stand as Rome's equal in the western Mediterranean. That place was ours now, though I do not remember anyone saying it in so many words on the field itself. We were too tired for grand phrases. What I remember is the look on the faces of men who had survived too much. Some were young and would someday speak of Zama as the day Rome won its greatest victory in Africa. Some were older and only stared at the ground as if trying to understand why they were still standing, while others were not. I thought of the years between Cannae and this day. I thought of the Roman dead, the towns burned, the families emptied, the fear that had once been so large it had seemed permanent. Scipio had answered it by refusing to let fear choose the battlefield. That is the lesson I carried away from Africa. Not that Rome was invincible. I had seen too much for that lie. Not that Hannibal was weak. He was not. But war rewards the side that learns faster than it bleeds. And Scipio had learned the shape of Hannibal's strengths and answered them with patience, discipline, cavalry, and timing. Masiniss's riders mattered, yes. So did the steadiness of our infantry and the decision to force Carthage to defend its own ground. No single hand won that day alone. It was the whole design that held. In the years after, men would speak of Zama as the battle that marked Rome's rise to dominance in the western Mediterranean. That sounds larger than the field felt to me that day, but history is made of moments that do not look grand from the inside. To us, it was the end of a long dread. To Carthage, it was the beginning of submission. To Hannibal, perhaps it was the final proof that genius cannot forever outrun a state that has learned how to adapt. As for me, I walked among the dead and thought of Cannae. I did not feel that old battle vanish. I do not think it ever will. Some wounds close cleanly. Others leave a seam you can feel in cold weather for the rest of your life. Zama did not heal Cannae. It answered it. It placed one memory beside the other and made them speak across 14 years. At Cannae, Rome had been surrounded and broken. At Zama, Rome stood firm and turned the war back on Hannibal at last. I am old now, and I know that victory does not return the dead. But Zama ended the fear Hannibal had carved into Rome and gave the Republic its place in the world. Zama ended Carthage's challenge to Rome and closed the wound Cannae had left open for 14 years.